Hello, welcome to this week's Opening Bell. I'm boxing news editor Tris Dixon, joined by John Dennen. There's an early curveball for everyone. Matt's still away in New York. I'm sure he's probably still shopping for hats to cover that cranium of his. It's because it's cold, John, not because it's an unsightly cranium.
No, you might say that. I can possibly comment.
How you doing, John?
Pretty good.
So at short notice, because we were going to have Bob Mee ringside for us in Stuttgart, he unfortunately couldn't cover the fights for us. Fortunately, however, John was an able replacement, and you went
just
there.
Able.
Well,
reasonably
capable,
competent.
yeah, average, decent. John replaced Bob and went to Stuttgart. And I know we're joking about things now, but it was actually an emotional night, I guess, for all involved. Those who've seen Darren Barker and been on his journey from a distance or up close saw him finally break down as a result of his hip injuries. What was it like being there, John?
Yeah, it ended up being almost exactly the opposite to what I was expecting to see, because I thought it was sort of Felix Sturm's last hurrah, and that Darren was going to be, he's only 31 and was going to be the next big thing in British boxing, and then to see his hip go, so you could see it was a real shock when it happened, and a bit confusing at first, and then you slowly piece together that he started having trouble with his hip in round one. It was almost quite heartbreaking to see that, because he wanted to fight on, but just physically couldn't. Yeah,
I mean, he was stopped from fighting on, wasn't he, by his corner and the referee, who I think had seen enough by then. Because you talk about it being Sturm's last hurrah. I mean, credit to Sturm, he came out and he really meant business from the first bell, didn't he?
Yeah, he looked excellent. He came out much more active than he does normally. He looked very strong, very sharp. The first left hook he caught Barker with looked like it hurt.
I think he's got underrated power as well. I was speaking to Tony Sims about this before the Barker fight, and if you look at the Macklin and Murray fights, and obviously Macklin and Murray are durable guys, he hurt them at both on occasion. So he clearly packs a punch as well. And Darren, I would have said, arguably was more fragile than those two. Certainly when you factor in his injuries and everything else behind that. So it kind of wasn't a surprise that he was hurt, but obviously the way the fight unfolded and how quickly it all unfolded was a surprise.
Yeah, and I suppose Sturm is quite economical with what he does, but when he lands, it has a big effect.
I mean, it made a mocker in my preview. Here was me thinking the veteran Sturm was going to turn on and put his foot on the pedal the last 30 seconds of each round and just try and nick it and stuff. He completely did the opposite, didn't he? I mean, he sort of done his best work in the first 2.5 minutes, and Barker really needed a knockdown to level up the first round.
Yeah, but it showed that I think Sturm must have known that everything for him depended on this. Because he said, when I asked him after the fight about how much he had at stake, he said, "Oh, I never thought about losing. You can't think like that." But if he had lost, his current TV deal is coming to an end.
He'd had no leverage, would he?
Yeah.
And now he's in a position where he can handpick opponents again for a while. I'd imagine. I think he'd have a 6-month clemency where he can get voluntary in with the IBF. And so, I mean, the lucrative Sturm business continues, doesn't it? I mean, and when we say lucrative Sturm business, we know that they are major financial players over there, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And as he negotiates his next deal, he's that's surely going to be big money, and he's a big name over there. I think he's the third most viewed boxer after the two Klitschko's, who we know get huge figures. Huge viewers in Germany, and he fills up arenas just on the power of his name alone.
So, I mean, you've spoken afterwards to Tony Sims and Eddie Hearn. What was the mood like in Team Barker after the fight? I mean, in the immediate aftermath, locker room stuff, behind stage.
Very, I suppose, downbeat in a way, but I think more just, worried for Darren, because I think Tony said something like he wasn't so much talking about the boxing. He was saying that Barker, he's got he wants to be able to play with his kid and that kind of stuff, to be able to run around, but he's dealing with this such a potentially serious injury that it could really hamper him. So they were talking more sort of, what's his life going to be like in 10 years' time? Is he going to be able to play football with his children or ride a bicycle? So it was almost talking about it was talking about the bigger picture. It was much more sort of, it was much more affecting than just even
just the night and the title.
Losing a world title.
I mean, having spoken to Darren on Monday, that's very much the crux of the interview that you can find online that I've done with Darren, where he says, the main thing he's been worrying about is the hip and the injury, and it's almost an afterthought that he's actually lost his world title.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it does show that things are bigger than boxing. When you're certainly, if you're a family man, you've got children, you want to be able to play with those children and all the rest of it. It puts everything into perspective in terms of what you want out of life, and not everyone's made that way. But clearly, Darren Barker and I know a few other fighters are, and like I said, it puts things into perspective.
Yeah, and like Eddie Hearn was saying, how glad he was that they went for this big money fight, even though it was over in Germany. Because if his hip had broken down against
for 250,000 rather than $1 million or something.
Yeah, I don't know if it was quite that much he got for this, but it was a lot, wasn't it?
Yeah. Just another word. Obviously, you've been over to Germany for this, and you had a taste of the undercard. What was the undercard like?
It was the worst I've ever seen. It was just. They just couldn't be bothered, not the boxers, but the promoters in terms of organising, a decent show. It was fairly ludicrous, So there was an unbeaten heavyweight who was old and got tired pretty quickly. Connie Conrad looked like he could, punch. He was decent. A female world title fight between Susie Kintikian and Simone Galassi was really, they just missed each other a lot. It was bizarre. They had a 3-round K1 kickboxing contest, which.
Well, you got a bit of a kickboxing past, JD. Were you not enthralled by that?
I wasn't impressed on a technical level.
Okay. All right, so the less said about the undercard, the better, and really it wasn't the top of the bill fight we were hoping for either, in the sense that I think a lot of people maybe didn't see it as a 50-50 fight, slightly favoured Barker, but everyone thought it was going to be a long, close, hard-fought fight. Yeah,
and I think it was shaping up to be a really good fight because Sturm came out so fast.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's easy to say, Sturm's to roll back the years, but he didn't do it for 12 rounds, did he?
Yeah.
He did it for 1.5.
Exactly.
So, and against for half that time against a sitting duck as well. So, we still don't know what Sturm's got left, do we?
No, but we know that he certainly reinvigorated his career, and that he'd probably say with a rematch with Matthew Macklin, you'd probably favour Sturm again in Germany, even though it was controversial the first time around.
I think what's interesting, what Sturm said, I think in your report, is that he said that he had been almost cutting corners a bit in training. Not cutting corners, but hadn't been training as hard. And Sturm I've always had down as a hard worker. I think if you go on YouTube, there's some great videos, training montages of Sturm training. And you always put him down as a real pro, but he says he's found something now. I suppose it happens when a fighter does have his back to the wall. He found something for this fight, an extra bit of motivation, extra push, which wasn't there against Sam Solomon, and he says against Daniel Gill too. So perhaps this is an opportunity, maybe this is a sort of reborn Sturm, but I think, the proof of the pudding's always going to be in the eating, isn't it? We won't find out until he's in deep and in a hard 12-round fight. Yeah,
but it certainly sounded like he'd sort of changed the way he made weight, maybe extended his training camp, and maybe what he was doing between training camps wasn't living the life. But he certainly seemed to think that he changed everything now, and he certainly walks and talks like a champion.
Yeah, okay. Interesting stuff. Matt is obviously in New York still. He's gone missing in Brooklyn.
Looking for a hat.
Yeah. But he was there to see Paulie Malignaggi against Judah, and he produced a lovely bit of writing. this week on the bill in New York. Now, obviously, you were in Germany, so didn't watch the fights live, but were you surprised that Paulie Malignaggi kind of one-sidedly beats Judah?
Yeah, not surprised that he won, but that he was so dominant. But I suppose, Zab must be on the decline now.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the final nails in the career of Zab Judah. You'd like to, you'd think now, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Especially losing at home in New York, in Brooklyn, the last place he would have wanted to lose. It's hard to see where he goes now. Malignaggi always talks the talk. Mention the likes of Broner and Mayweather as opponents. Mayweather, I can't see the fight getting done. I just can't. No matter how much they talk. And although the build-up for that, imagine that, the sort of 24/7 or the all-access Mayweather, Malignaggi, I'm sure that would shift some tickets over 3 or 4 episodes, but I can't see that being a sellable fight. What is more sellable is, providing he wins this weekend, is a rematch with Adrien Broner.
Yeah, definitely, because he gave Broner
a real argument.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah, which I suppose was quite a surprise considering how touted Broner is.
Yeah, and I mean, Broner was moving up from lightweight as well. It was his first fight at welterweight, and he sort of really had his hands full with one of the softest punching guys in the division. So this weekend, and we'll move on to that a bit later on, he goes in with one of the hardest hitters. Possibly one of the biggest shocks, I'd say for me, I'm not sure for everyone, but was seeing Devin Alexander getting turned over by Sean Porter. I think perhaps, I don't know if you agree, perhaps this goes to show exactly what can happen to a fighter if he sits around and waits for a big fight too long.
Yeah. I mean, I was really surprised at the result. So again, I've always thought very highly of Devin Alexander and thought he was a bit sort of misunderstood and underappreciated and been unfairly sort of criticised after, the Tim Bradley loss and that kind of thing. But I suppose, he's just sort of started to fade away, hasn't he?
I mean, the thing is, he sat around, he was waiting for the Amir Khan fight. There was talk of him earlier in the year when Mayweather sent out that tweet saying, my opponent's going to be we're going to be Devin Alexander. Alexander's been waiting on the call for those big fights. And then when you're put in against a guy who, with all due respect to Sean Porter, who's had 2 good fights with Julio Diaz, it's not the kind of fight that you're looking for. You're looking for one with ideally a couple more zeros on the end of the paycheck, rather than the actual opponent. So Alexander might have been guilty of taking his eye off the ball. Porter certainly made him pay. But Devin Alexander, it's tough to know sort of where he'd come back now, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, he has to come back, but I suppose the mental side of it is the most important of it. Can he come back, as hungry and determined to make a splash as he once was? And, who does he come back against? Who do people want to see him in the ring with? Because now he doesn't have the world title, does he? Do people need him or want him? Yeah,
I mean, that's a perfectly valid point, really. I mean, he is going to be one of those in the who needs him club, really.
Yeah.
He's not bringing a world title to the table anymore. He's just bringing an awkward southpaw style that no one really wants to fight. So high risk, low reward. I'm sure it won't be on box office or even maybe on a big HBO or Showtime bill. We'll have to see. It all depends. I mean, the thing with... it's interesting to factor in where Kell Brook stands here. I spoke to Eddie Hearn about this a couple of days ago. So Brook, I think they had mixed feelings waiting for Devin Alexander, because I think there's a touch of negativity about whether that fight could be made 10 times and 10 times it will fall through. It's one of those sort of cursed fights. But now with Sean Porter winning the title, he has 6 months before he has to fight a mandatory challenger, and he can fight a voluntary beforehand. I very much doubt that voluntary will be against Kell Brook. Least of all, I doubt he'll volunteer to come over to Sheffield to fight Kell Brook. So I can't really see that fight going on any time soon. It means Brook should be looking for a dance partner in the near future. Perhaps he'll have one eye on the winner of this weekend's fight between Leonard Bundu and Lee Purdy.
Yeah, I suppose so, but I suppose it's a bit... when he's on the cusp of a world title fight, to then come back to European level is, again...
You've got to keep the ball rolling, though, haven't you? You've got to keep the ball rolling.
But I was just thinking more from his point of view, motivation-wise, he could be in a similar situation to Alexander. Just he's been waiting around for too long, starts to fade away from the great form he had against, say, Zinchenko.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting stuff. There's also a big fight. There's a few on that Brooklyn bill, but really interesting fight in the sense that Erislandy Lara was a commanding winner over Austin Trout. If you guys listened last week, you'll know that I kind of thought, or I did think that Lara and Trout and Malignaggi-Judah would be very close fights, but Lara was actually quite dominant against Trout. And now there are calls for Lara to fight Sal Alvarez. I think that's a perfectly feasible fight, but Lara now, with this convincing win of Trout, who had a very close fight with Alvarez. I'm just wondering if anyone's actually going to mention in the mainstream Lara as an opponent for Floyd Mayweather.
Yeah, why not? It makes sense, doesn't it?
This is a guy who's a decorated Cuban amateur who's been robbed on the scorecards a couple of times, who was in a fun fight earlier in the year against Alfredo Angulo, and who's now defeated one of the top guys at light middleweight convincingly. I'm not sure what else you need to do to state your claim to fight Mayweather.
Yeah, surely in pure boxing terms, he's got the winning argument, but maybe Mayweather's looking for someone who brings a level of fame or a good story for all the promotional side of things.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Obviously, Twitter's king in America, in boxing in America a lot of the time, and Amir Khan's there with more than 1 million followers. So I think that's that answered. And you look at Victor Ortiz, who challenged Mayweather before. He hadn't really done anything massive in boxing to get his shot at Mayweather, but he brought a great story to 24/7. So yeah. I think you're right. And does Lara have that kind of story? I'm not sure. Possibly if they wanted to dig hard enough, they could find the story, but I very much doubt that they'd want to. Plus, it is one of those fights we talked about. Alexander just then, high reward. Low risk, high risk, low reward, and it is more one of those. I'm not saying the risk is really high. I'm not saying Mayweather wouldn't beat him, but he's a big physical unit at light middleweight. And Floyd, the guys who he most commonly mentioned for his next fight are going to be at welterweight or even light welterweight.
Yeah.
So
and surely Amir is high reward but low risk.
Yeah, you'd have to put him in that category, wouldn't you? It'd be up to him to prove us all wrong. So, frustratingly good, the headline for Guillermo Rigondeaux, who's beating Joseph Agbiko, but still not getting credit certainly from Jack Obermeyer in Boxing News. But the guy is quality, isn't he? He's brilliant at what he does, Rigondeaux.
Yeah, it's such a shame, really, that he gets criticised for being boring, or just because he's so good. I mean, he's a master of the art of boxing. He hits, doesn't get hit. He's just the way he handled an outstanding fighter like Dennen is just incredible. And again, what he didn't shed a round against Agbiko. But yeah, you almost feel sorry for Rigondeaux.
Yeah, I mean it makes you wonder. And I think I put this at the end of the piece. What do Top Rank have to do to make Rigondeaux a star? How can they do it?
It's a good question.
Do you think? Let me pitch some ideas. Say I'm Rigondaux's promoter. What I do is Rigondeaux, we know, defected from Cuba, and we know he left family behind. And in fact, we've seen pictures, I think, of a distraught family, haven't we, left behind? In fact, because you spoke to Rigondeaux not long after he defected, didn't you?
Yeah.
And did quite a big interview for us back then. And I think the thing we've got. So what I do is, if I was Top Rank, I'd go and pitch a Rigondeaux documentary to HBO. That would be one of my first ports of call. Then I would get that documentary and I'd make it go viral, as viral as possible on social media. And I know Top Rank has massive social media reach. And then I try and take things from there. You work out different things, and it's not just about the opponents, but you need to figure out a way to sell the guy. And that means, and one of the things that people get attracted to boxing for is the characters. And I don't really see anyone going out of their way to sell Guillermo Rigondeaux as a character.
Yeah. Then I suppose him not speaking English is a bit of a drawback in really him, the fans getting to know what his personality's like and who he is. But he's got a great story. He's got the mystique of this incredible amateur and everything he accomplished in that side of the sport, having to leave his family and homeland to defect to the US.
And there was a failed attempt or two, wasn't there, to get him come across, if I remember rightly?
Yeah, and we don't really know how, what happens to a Cuban boxer when the authorities there know he wants to escape and obviously have minders on his tail to stop him from getting out. And I bet that's a fascinating story. Perhaps part of the problem is Guillermo doesn't really like talking about that chapter of his life. When I interviewed him, he didn't want to go into it in any great detail of how he actually got across and the mechanics of it all. Maybe because it would get his family back home in trouble. Maybe because it would get other boxers now in trouble. Like, there are interesting things going on at the moment. Say, like, we haven't seen Ronnie Iglesias, who was one of, for me, the best boxer of the last Olympics. He lost a decision in a national Cuban tournament. I don't know how political that was, and they haven't sent him overseas for any bouts. They didn't send him to the World Championships, and I wonder if that's because he wants to. I'm just speculating.
Jump ship,
but yeah, literally. And he is an amazing fighter. So maybe I'm just speculating, but maybe sort of Rigondeaux himself is cautious about what he says about that.
Okay.
And there does seem to be a bit of a hostility in America towards Cuban fighters. I don't know if it's their style or
certainly
Cuban
not in
politics.
Florida, where I think that's another thing that they can do is they can build a fan base in Florida where there's a big Cuban community and get the guys get the guys followed, and I think that would be a sensible place to start. And I also think another part of Rigondeaux that seems interesting is the guy always seems to be in shape and ready to fight. We know a lot of Cubans have headed west, in inverted commas, and been dazzled by the bright lights and the nightlife and the women and all the rest of it, and fallen for it hook, line and sinker, and haven't fulfilled their potential and gone AWOL and this, that and the other. Rigondeaux seems to be a slightly different animal in that respect, doesn't he? He seems to be very focused on what he's got to do.
Yeah. You think of someone like Solis, who sort of just ballooned in weight, had his diamond-encrusted SpongeBob SquarePants necklace. But
How can we forget? Yeah.
But like Rigondeaux may have changed trainers a couple of times, but he seems dedicated and focused on the sport, and certainly sounded like that when I spoke to him all that time ago.
Yeah. Okay. Fight of the week, quite possibly Glenn Tapia against James Kirkland. Tapia, we spoke. You met Tapia in Las Vegas relatively recently. Nice guy. Unfortunately, fell short against Kirkland. Kirkland breathes new life into his career, though at the same time, which is only a good thing because this guy is one of the most exciting fighters around today. He can punch. He's in a lot of exciting fights. And he's just been in another one here. So that's not a bad thing. What I instantly thought of, actually, was Pat Lynch, with Glenn Tapia's manager, who used to manage Arturo Gatti. And you remember, after your Glenn Tapia piece ran, I emailed Pat Lynch to say it was coming out. And he said, I wasn't going to fall in love with another fighter after Arturo, but I've fallen for Glenn Tapia. And I thought, he's got to be really crushed now because... it's never good. He's been with Tapia since the start, all the way through, and he's seen the guy have his first defeat. That said, he was in a similar position with Arturo Gatti, where he had a real talented kid who lost a fight of the year type fight, and he brought him back. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of job Pat Lynch does with Glenn Tapia now as a result of the James Kirkland fight. Hopefully, he'll be brought back slowly, but. That wasn't always the case with Arturo Gatti and how he was brought back after defeats. So in that case, look for Tapia Kirkland too in February. But no, seriously, hope Tapia is brought back at a decent speed, and I hope that Kirkland lands a good fight with someone entertaining, someone who can bring out the entertainment in him. I think that's a real crucial thing for Kirkland because I think he can be outboxed by some of the more masterful boxers out there.
Yeah, who would you like to see him in with?
Well, I think there's a few good fights out there for him. I don't know how easily he does like middleweight. I could see him going up to middleweight and fighting someone like Curtis Stevens. I think that would be a nice fight.
Yeah.
I think there's some really good matches out there for him. Wouldn't mind seeing him and Angulo again. Angulo obviously lost to Lara earlier in the year, so that's another fun, sort of fan-friendly pairing. There's plenty of options out there for him. I think Tapia's the one that will need kid gloves for the next 6 or 8 months. So, also on that bill, Matthew Macklin returned to the ring, outpointing Lamar Russ. But I know time's getting away with us, so I just want to touch upon an English show before heading back overseas, and that is where Matt and I warned last week that Derry Mathews tends to lose fights that he should win or is expected to win, and he slipped up on Stephen Ormond, who is a quality banana skin if ever there was one, because Ormond can fight. I've seen him a few times in the flesh. Really good, hard fighter, who was bound to give Derry a difficult night, whether he won, lost or drew. And Derry did slip up, meaning his remarkable year, which has been a brilliant year, ends on a defeat. Doesn't really accurately reflect the rest of 2013, because he's really been one of Britain's standouts, hasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I suppose his incredible comeback, his incredible one-punch comeback against Tommy Coyle must still be the highlight of his year, because what a fight that was. But
I think that was the highlight of many boxing fans' year as well. I think that was one of the times in the year where casual fight fans and obviously Derry's fans would have been leaping to their feet as what it won, because it was just one of those spectacular moments, wasn't it?
I mean, Derry Mathews has really been in some hard fights, to deliver entertainment, but he's really given a lot to boxing, hasn't he?
Yeah, he really has. And then it was great to see Liam Smith have his standout win of his young career. There's obviously a lot of speculation, a lot of hype. Initially, it was about Stephen Smith. Then it came about Callum Smith, and Liam's kind of gone under the radar as a consequence. Not really anymore after a very, very dominant performance against Mark Thompson.
Yeah, absolutely. It seemed slightly earlier on in his professional career he was not going through the motions, but he wasn't creating a buzz like some of his brothers did in their early fights. But he really seems to be coming into his own. And again, we're asking the hard question: who's the best boxer in the Smith family?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's going to be a big year for the family, with certainly Callum pushing on for bigger titles, and now Liam turning the corner, and Stephen Smith, who looks like he could be being massaged up the WBC ranks with international titles and all the rest of it. So I want to go overseas though, because obviously you've done a big preview this week. Adrien Broner against Marcos Maidana. It's an interesting fight. Many levels, not least because everyone wants to see what happens to Broner when he gets hit really, really hard. Not just because they want to see him get hit really, really hard, although that is the case in many quarters. I was in Las Vegas when they announced the fight, and I know the cynics out there will think it was prearranged. Personally, I was there, and I didn't think it was, but I was in the media centre doing an interview with Amir Khan. Let me see how many names I can drop into the next sentence. I was in the media centre hanging out with Amir Khan, and Marcos Maidana came by, and I think he was waiting on the peripheries to speak to Amir, bear in mind that they fought a few years ago.
Sure he didn't want to speak to you?
Quite sure. Although that's saying
he was waiting politely.
He was in queue.
Yeah.
So anyway, Maidana was sort of waiting on the peripheries a little bit uncomfortably, but I think he was waiting to speak to Amir just to sort of shake his hand and all the rest of it. And then in walks Adrien Broner, who walks cockily, swaggers past Maidana, who sort of tried to reach out to shake his hand. Broner snubbed him, walked straight past. And then Broner comes up to Amir Khan, puts his arm around Amir Khan and says, basically like, "Oh, I'm coming over to England." And Amir's like, "Oh, when are you coming over? I'll hook you up and all the rest of it, and I'll look out for you." And as these gangster folk do. And they were chatting like best friends. And then, anyway, Khan was pulled in a different direction, and that left Broner on his own, who, let's face it, does like being the centre of attention. So what better way to go than go and see Maidana, who was still this peripheral figure, sort of hanging awkwardly on the outskirts like the uncool kids, with the two cool kids in the clique walking through the room. And so Broner went back up and walked straight up to Maidana, got straight in his face, went head to head with Maidana, and they started jaw-jacking at one another. And when Adrien Broner checked his walk with Khan to go back and see Maidana, there was me and maybe 4 or 5 other people who had camera phones or anything, and all of a sudden the whole media centre swept to see Broner and Maidana go head to head, knowing that they were going to be fighting soon. And the atmosphere was great because Maidana is not a guy to be messed with.
No.
He's like Broner, he's had his own issues in the past. We know that he likes guns and has a tattoo of a gun on his stomach because, according to All Access, he likes guns. But on a more serious note, Maidana is a crushing puncher. Certainly was at light welterweight, perhaps less so at welterweight. But we said earlier that Broner had his hands full with a soft punching welterweight, and now he's going in with a very, very stiff hitter.
Yeah. And Maidana's he's a tough guy too. He's really resilient. Like, that body shot Amir Khan got him with, to bounce back from that. Broner surely will have his hands full, but then maybe it might turn out that a boxer like Malignaggi, who's fast and skillful, Broner finds that more difficult than someone like Maidana, who's been developing with Robert Garcia and trying to adapt, but isn't as fast, is probably more predictable.
Doesn't adapt as well, perhaps.
Yeah, he could be. Even though he is more dangerous, he could be the kind of style that Broner looks good against.
Yeah, I mean, you see Broner thrived against Antonio DeMarco, didn't he?
Yeah.
Really his breakout performance, I'd say it was, but other people might say the Litzau win was. But yeah, I mean, Maidana's a few grades up from Gavin Rees, again, with all due respect. Because Maidana's obviously been a world champion so was Gavin Rees for that matter. But I think Maidana's proved himself at a higher level over a longer period of time. But it's an interesting one. I mean, the big question is what happens if Broner gets hit cleanly by Maidana. And I mean, A, do you think he will get hit cleanly by Maidana? And B, if he does, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably won't, but he could almost do with being caught and being in trouble, because it would earn him the sort of respect that his antics don't. Like the way Khan came through the Maidana fight, he came out of it with so much more respect because he was, in real trouble and had to real gut it out. If Broner can have these moments of difficulty and show that he's got, a will to win and a strength of character, that to have come this far in boxing he must do, but to demonstrate it would probably be good for him. However,
sort of humble him in the ring a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sure it wouldn't outside of the ring, but maybe to the.
But you're right. It would go. I think fight fans would hold him in a higher esteem if he did have to go through the wall, as they call it in the marathon, don't they?
Yeah.
If he sort of has to bite down and fight back when in real trouble.
Yeah, but he has looked very good so far and hasn't really done a lot wrong. So this could probably end up the showcase for him that Golden Boy won, but I imagine the casual fan would be rooting for a simple, straightforward, hard man like Maidana to do the business.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, just looking at the Maidana track record, is obviously he was down early against Khan, he was down early against Victor Ortiz. Not the fastest starter. Broner, we know, has been out of the blocks quickly against numerous people. So, do you know what? There's something. When I first heard about this fight, I thought it was a relatively straightforward points win for Broner. The more I thought about it, the more I think. And I had quite a long chat with Freddie Roach about this. Let me just carry on the name dropping thing. But in fact, there was a couple of interesting things that came from Freddie Roach. If you look in BN Active this week, in the print and digital publication. You'll see what Freddie Roach has to say about Broner. There's some really, really telltale stuff in there. And so having spoken to Freddie, I do have more questions about Broner than I had before. But at the same time, I do think Maidana's on the downside. And I think this is a showcase opportunity for Broner to unleash some real skill, real power, real potential. And basically show what he can do, which he didn't do against Malignaggi. So I think he could break Maidana down and stop him late.
That would be something. But I suppose, do you think the longer he spends at welterweight, the more his power will come on in that weight
Could
class?
do. I mean, when there were those early press conference shots of him, I've got no idea what he weighed, but he looked huge. huge. So,
He didn't look in shape either.
No, it's clear that he hasn't. It's clear that A, he hasn't been walking around at his normal weight, and B, that he doesn't walk around at welterweight either. So, I mean, he still had to strip down to get to the weight. That said, I mean, I saw pictures of him a while ago, and he was in fantastic condition. So, whatever excess weight he did have clearly went soon enough.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's Broner is a fascinating character. Maybe not to be around necessarily, because you don't get, in terms of being an interviewer, you don't get much out of him. But in the stuff on All Access and the About Billions stuff that he does on YouTube, it's proper car crash TV, and you can't take your eyes off it as much as you want to.
I mean, is there method to his madness? Does he
do
behave
you know
like
what?
this for a reason, or is it just instinct?
I think a lot of it comes from him wanting to be like Floyd Mayweather, and do you know what? When I was at the one show, Mayweather Alvarez, which regular listeners will know I've referred back to fairly often, they had all those stars up on the stage. They had Khan, they had Andre Ward, they had Maidana, they had their whole stable up there. And I know Andre Ward isn't in their stable, but he was on the podium. They had about 20 or so fighters, Victor Ortiz, and everyone got cheered and clapped and applauded up to the arena, up to the stage. And there's 10,000 people there at the weigh-in. Or 12, if my memory serves me right. And hundreds more couldn't get in. But anyway, that's another story. And Broner started to walk up to the podium or stage, and the boos were deafening, absolutely deafening. So is there method to his madness? Yes, there is. The guy knows that if people boo you, they want to see you get beaten. And if people want to see you, whether they want to see you win or want to see you get beaten, they still want to see you, and that costs money.
Yeah.
So there's method to the madness, and I think what was really interesting actually in the first All Access episode from Broner Maidana is the interesting thing with Mayweather, and I think it clearly shows that there are issues with Broner here, is that Mayweather said Broner needs to know when to turn it on and when to turn it off. And I think that's the problem. I don't think Broner has an off switch at the moment.
Yeah.
He needs to learn when to switch certain things off, and like his video camera most of the time. But he needs to learn where the off switch is, and needs to learn to come out of character or be himself, one of the two.
Because I suppose the thing with Mayweather is even if people don't like him, they do hang on his every word. They do respect what he has to say.
It's what Mayweather says is relevance, and the booing shows how relevant he is. If you were there with recording the decibel levels, Broner's would have been off the charts and everyone's would have been quite respectable. So is what Broner's doing working? Yeah, I think it is, definitely. Do I admire what he's doing? No, I don't. But at the same time, the guy wants to be relevant, and he's relevant, so he's doing what he set out to do. What he set out to do. So. It's kind of sort of a grudging thing. He's doing what he wants to do. So,
do you ever wonder what Broner's trainer Mike Stafford thinks of his antics? Because
all the time, I wonder that.
Stafford must be a good man, like taking kids off the street, giving them, taking them into a boxing gym. If this kid's
a father figure, why doesn't he clip Broner around the ear all the time? I don't know. I've got no idea, and obviously, I don't know. I couldn't really comment. I think. In the office, we speak to Mike Stafford fairly frequently. He's always very happy to deal with the guys. But there's only so, whether their relationship now has become strictly professional or whatever, you just don't know. Be a good feature though, John. Perhaps you can get your teeth into that in the new year.
I'd be fascinated too.
Good. Okay, you've signed yourself up for an early assignment, 2014. Just before we leave, I just want to touch upon the Matchroom show this weekend. It's a really interesting mixed bag at Matchroom. I've given the show a 2-star rating overall, and I think I'm a little bit stingy in some respects now, because although the fights on the bill, bar the main event, haven't really captured my imagination, the more thought I've given them, the more competitive I think they actually are. See, I think Kevin Mitchell would be expected to blast out Zamora, but Zamora's tough, and Mitchell's not the fighter I think everyone thinks he is, or seems to think he is. So I think that's going to be a tough fight for Mitchell. And if it's not, then fair play to him. And then Sergey Kamitsky against Martin Murray. Murray's obviously only fought the once this year. Kamitsky, these guys fought in 2009, I think it was, and I even think I was there. And Martin Murray dropped him twice and then was put down in the 7th round, and it was actually a really hard fight for Martin Murray. And I know lots happened then, and Murray will be expected to beat him soundly, but they're still the same two human beings, and it was a tough fight then. And then there's a talent on the undercard showcase, so Cal Yafai, Martin Ward, Anthony Ogogo, and Jamie McDonnell. There's some good fighters on the bill, so perhaps I should have gone 3 stars rather than 2. I think you can make a case either way. That it didn't really capture my imagination sort of tells me it's a 2-star, but I don't think you should really have to look deeply into a bill and think, oh no, maybe it is 3 stars. I think you should look at it and think, wow. Yeah. So, but I look at the main event, Lee Purdy and Leonard Bundu, and I think, wow, there could be some good fireworks there. Neither of them really beat around the bush, both quite straightforward. Bundu, a 39-year-old southpaw, or switch hitter, should I say, but he's not a switch hitter in your traditional style, certainly not in your Ingle style. He's a guy who comes forwards, fights, and is happy to rumble, leading with the left or right. Purdy, we know, workmanlike, straightforward, a bit like Derry Mathews, wins fights he should lose and loses fights he should win. But gives great value for money, and I think that they will meet head on. I think Bundu might be a little bit too polished.
Yeah, I mean, when I spoke to Tony Sims, he was really positive about Lee Purdy's training camp, you know, emphasising he was well on the way, which obviously didn't happen when he came in at short notice. It's Devin Alexander. He was really saying, he obviously acknowledged that Purdy had a tough fight on his hands, but he was saying, well, of course he would say that he had a feeling he was going to get it done. I don't know. I guess Purdy's got a lot to prove, doesn't he? After, even though he came in at short notice against Alexander, it was a pretty tame showing, really. It was more an exercise of taking a lot of punches for a while. So he's got a lot to prove in this fight, but it's going to be tough. He's not.
I think you're right. I think it's going to be a tough fight. I know you're saying it's going to be tough for Lee, but I think it's going to be a grueling fight.
Yeah. And is he? Yeah, I suppose his opponent's getting on a bit, but is Lee?
Well, I spoke to Lee last week. Lee's interesting. Lee made an interesting point, actually. The guy he's fighting, Bundu's 29-0-2. That's his record. He's been at European level for a while now. And Lee would say, where's the guy's ambition to be 39, just hovering around at European level and not kicking on from there? So he sort of questioned his ambition a bit. And if he doesn't have ambition, why is he coming over here for a paycheck, or is he coming over here because he thinks Purdy's a pushover? It's interesting, isn't it? Interesting. It's a really interesting fight, fascinatingly poised, and I think it's going to be a really good weekend of boxing. Also, there's Jürgen Bremer fighting in Germany. We know that has implications further afield in the light heavyweight division, where so much of the talk at the moment is around Adonis Stevenson and Sergey Kovalev, two of the biggest sort of most heavily hyped and most discussed fighters in the world today. Hopefully those guys can get it on in 2014, but that's another matter altogether.
Who would you pick if they did?
I'd be siding with Kovalev, I think, right now.
It's interesting.
But I could see, you could make cases for either. I think Kovalev is the more damaging puncher, but I mean, what can I base that on? The fact that I just don't think I've seen him hit anyone clean, and yet everyone he's hit has still gone flying.
Yeah.
I think I think it would be whoever predicted that. I don't think there's any real science to picking that fight. Yeah. And I don't think it's either who lands first. I think they're two tough, hard men as well. So I think there could be plenty of punishment in there. So still on that punishing note, we will leave you to it. Just wanted to say in closing, actually, that it was a sad week this week, that we did lose a little South African jewel in baby Jake Matlala, one of the scourge of Britain's little men through the 90s, a well-loved fighter over here and in South Africa, one of Nelson Mandela's favourites, a true little warrior, and there's a lovely tribute to him in Bob Mee's guest column. Bob, who knew Matlala reasonably well, has paid a lovely tribute to him. It's well worth the read. On that sad note, I will leave you to it. John's going to the XL to watch Purdy Bundu. I'll be watching at home and staying up late for the fireworks of Maidana Broner. We'll be bringing you all the action from ringside, as always, next week. Until then, thanks a lot for listening.